Joining us for this month's Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force meeting. We're going to give you a couple brief policy updates before we jump into Doug Ryan's presentation on manufactured housing. I'll turn it over to Ethan Handelman to start to talk about the recent white paper on housing finance reform.
Thanks, Rebecca, and welcome again, folks. We saw an interesting release this week from the Treasury Department. Antonio Weiss and Karen Dinan put out what I guess I call a white paper. It's almost a blueprint for housing finance reform, which is an excellent document. It would have been more excellent 4 years ago, but I can say that about virtually every publication we do too. So there's no reason to fault them. The thing that I think is most interesting about it is it frames housing finance reform in the context of that front and center, which was not a feature of the discussion the last time there was major legislation on this. Remember, it's been 8 years since the financial crisis and the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's efforts and the need for the federal government to step in. We still don't have permanent housing finance reform. There was a congressional effort that was led in the Senate Banking Committee. It was a bipartisan effort. There was a lot going for it. Definitely not perfect. Ultimately failed to proceed because of not enough attention to the affordability end of the spectrum. The ultimate goal of a functioning housing finance system is that everyone can afford a home, whether it's rented or owned, because the system serves both sources. What we see in this paper is, in some ways, a rethinking of the approach that starts with the premise that everyone ought to be able to afford their housing and says, how would a system work to do that? It still doesn't have every specific bit we would ultimately need for an effort to move forward, but by framing it in that way, I think it potentially would set the debate going in a different direction. That said, this came out end of October at the end of the 8th year of the Obama administration, so they're not going to be the ones to carry this forward. It is useful parting wisdom. It is a good path for the next administration and the next Congress to follow in pursuing housing finance reform, and it's something NHC will be working on. But I think this is more of a period at the end of a sentence rather than the start of a new paragraph. I'm out of literary or typographical analogy, so I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Ethan. Just a couple other quick updates for you guys. One, the Federal Housing Finance Agency put out its annual report on the affordable housing activities of the GSEs, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And they met most of their goals for 2015. They fell just short of their low-income and very low-income home purchase goals, but again, they were close. But they met their low-income areas, home purchase goal, low-income refinance, and multifamily. So just something to be thinking about, especially as we expect the duty to serve rule, hopefully soon. HUD has published a proposed rule to implement the federal flood risk management standard, and we really want to bring this to your attention because NHC is going to comment on this. So if you have thoughts, if you want to be involved, please reach out to Ethan. HUD is proposing that properties receiving HUD assistance, financing, or insurance that's for new construction or substantial rehab would have to be elevated 2 feet above the base flood elevation, depending on their location and flood risk. And critical actions like hospitals would need to be elevated further. Comments are due December 27th, so in case you wanted to work around Christmas.
We'll be working on our comments significantly earlier, and I do encourage you all to reach out and share your thoughts, because this is an area of policy that doesn't always get a lot of attention, but has real long-term implications. Especially in 2017, we're going to see reauthorization, or we'll need to see reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program. It may take longer than a year. It did last time. But that will have impacts on regulated affordable housing, subsidized housing, but also just housing that we hope people can afford. We want to make sure that the affordable housing community is tuned into this and isn't sort of caught up in a bigger debate, but rather has a distinct voice, and make sure that whatever changes happen to that program, beyond this specific rule that we're looking at right now, make sure that whatever changes to that program don't negatively impact the affordability of housing.
So again, please reach out to Ethan if you have thoughts or comments on that proposed rule. My last update is I want to make sure folks are aware of NeighborWorks Project Reinvest. So this program is going to provide grant funding to community development financial institutions for down payment assistance loans to borrowers earning 100% of area median income or less. Now, eligible organizations are limited to nonprofit CDFIs who are doing a high volume of down payment assistance loans, but you should look for CDFIs in your community and make sure that they're, taking advantage of this opportunity and applying. The grant period is between January 2017 and January 2019, and applications are due really soon on November 14th. So just want to make sure folks are aware of that. And with that, I will turn it over to Doug Ryan and give me just 1 second to pull up his PowerPoint.
And don't worry, folks. I know we went through that stuff pretty fast, but it will all be in the notes, and Rebecca will have links to all of it in there. So you'll get a link to the white paper and a link to the flood rule and to the application form for the NeighborWorks grant, all of that. Before Doug starts, I just want to say thank you to Doug because it is always a pleasure to hear him talk, and this is a topic he has been working on for a long time and has developed significant expertise. So it's a treat for me, and I hope it will be a treat for you guys. It's all yours, Doug.
All right. Well, thank you, Ethan and Rebecca and everybody for joining us. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. So real quick, my name is Doug Ryan. I'm the Director of Affordable Homeownership at CFED, which is the Corporation for Enterprise Development. We are a nonprofit here in Washington, D.C. that works on asset building and wealth building for low and moderate income communities. And obviously homeownership is a piece of that. So one of the reasons why we talk about manufactured housing is in part because it is, we believe, an underappreciated in both uses of the term, part of the housing stock. So we'd like to make it better, both on the sense of quality, on tenure, and housing finance. So I'm going to touch on a couple of those things and also talk about the market and why this is such a challenge. Rebecca raised the duty to serve. As you all know, duty to serve is deeply important to this part of the housing stock. It's one of the 3 carve-outs. We are waiting with a great deal of anticipation to see what Fannie and Freddie are able to do, and we're hopeful. We had a role in obviously in the comment period, and we've had conversations. We're looking forward to see what they finally come up with, but we are optimistic. So what I'm going to go through is a couple of these things. One of the problems with manufactured housing, frankly, is its image, and to some degree, that's if you on your screen now, those are 3 very different units. The one on the bottom shows what people often think about at post-storm, post-incident, that it's a fire trap, that it's tornado bait, all those kinds of things. And very poorly built units in the 50s and 60s are frankly not safe and frankly not worth preserving. I mean, we can be clear about that with some exceptions. They were poorly built, and as you know, until 1976, there was no regulation of these products. They were mobile homes. Now they're manufactured homes with the only national building code in the country. The units on top, that's a park, a trailer park, for lack of a better word, frankly, in the Coachella Valley in California, and it is one of the most impoverished parts of the country, and frankly, it's a disgrace that we have to worry about people living in such conditions, an unhealthy environment. But it's also the type of community that people think about when they deride trailer parks and manufactured housing and mobile homes. And frankly, that's not fair, but it also means that we need to do a better job to improve these communities with such things as infrastructure improvements, water and sewer, amenities, and frankly, redevelopment if appropriate. Finally, the home on the right is also a manufactured home. That's exactly what people wouldn't think about. But as you can see, that is a higher end one. There's no doubt about that. But it is something that can easily blend into communities across the country, be used to match the housing stock in an existing community, can be part of an affordable subdivision or a new subdivision. It can be used for infill, all of which has been done, but at a too small of a scale, except for in places like California where that home is actually, I believe. There had been a lot of progress in California prior to the crisis, and we'd like to revisit that kind of effort. And then some data. This bar chart is imperfect because It starts in 1998 and then jumps to 2007. But 1998 was, and the reason why I'm doing that is just to show the contrast. 1998 was the high watermark for the industry. They built about, they put out the door about 380,000, 375,000 units that year, before the biggest financing company went belly up in the largest bankruptcy at the time until Enron, soon after. And that's because they were making bad loans, not worried about repayment, but they were worried about fees, and obviously that sounds familiar. But then they never recovered, and those blue bars through the rest of the way just shows how they crashed post-crisis, in part because of the failure of Conseco, which is that company, put so many repossessed homes on the market, so there was no need for new homes in some ways. But secondly, they had a deservedly bad reputation. Fannie Mae backed out to buy. They wouldn't buy personal property loans any longer, which drives this stuff, and lots of other things. But we do believe that this industry has some potential to get back into the game. Right now, I would expect 2016 to deliver about 70,000 units, which would be its highest since 2008. And I think that's an important piece of the market. You can see the orange bar on the bottom is the share of the single-family housing starts. It remains pretty constant at about 7 or 9%, give or take, depending on the year. Now, as a caveat, let me say that we, of course, are not a shill for the industry. In fact, we have grave differences with the industry on certain things, and I'll talk about those. But we do believe that this can be embraced and done properly in many different ways, and we could talk about that in a second. Just like all the other housing advocates, myself included in the world, aren't shills for the National Association of Home Builders, but we don't stop working with them either. All right, on that note, this is an interesting piece of data from 2014, and it hasn't changed meaningfully, but if you look at this, these are millions of units, obviously, from 2014. Manufactured homes deeply, strikingly outdo all those other types of affordable housing, which are all rentals, of course. About 3/4 of manufactured homes are owner-occupied. But it's not even close, the number of manufactured homes in comparison to those other housing stock that we desperately want to preserve as housing advocates, and rightfully so. Everyone knows about, and when I say Section 8 there, the green bar is Section 8 new construction, obviously. The vouchers are vouchers. But the USDA program is mostly the 515 program. And we all remember the Section 8 crisis, the preservation crisis that's been going on for 30 years, and we are still concerned about it, as we should be. There is a growing, perhaps less recognized crisis in the 515 sector, which we need to be worried about. But those pale in comparison to the manufactured homes that are disappearing that could be preserved at a much lower cost. And that's something we need to get our arms around. Now, again, as I said at the opening, not every home or community should be preserved or is worthy of our investment or even our time, but many, many are, and we have to figure out how to move forward with that. So I don't want to spend too much on this, but CFPD has this program called the Innovations in Manufactured Homes. Home is the clever acronym that somebody long ago came up with. So that's what we call it, and it has 4 components to it, and I just want to tell you why we think each of these are important. So we talk about new and replacement development. So this is about replacement of those existing homes, like the ones in the Coachella Valley, if that was possible, but also throughout the country. Right now we're focused on trying to figure out a replacement program, for example, for Appalachia. We are trying to do some work in the Delta, but also there's lots of communities in urban and suburban areas that need new and replacement development. And it's a strategy I think that can work, working with some of the programs that are out there, but also most importantly perhaps duty to serve if we can get our arms around that. And just as a note, and I should have mentioned this early on, is that another fact that people don't recognize, I think, in this space is that 46% of manufactured homes are in rural areas, but 47% are in suburban areas. They are all around us, literally surrounding every central city that you can imagine. And that's an affordable housing stock that is often not considered in consolidated planning. It's not listed as part of the affordable housing stock, so it's not considered for CDBG or home monies, both of which it is eligible for, by the way, and we can talk a little bit about that. Not to mention that it's not considered for first-time home buyer programs for most state HFAs and that kind of stuff, particularly if it's in community. So we do think this is important, and we do think a replacement strategy would actually further mainstream this part of the housing market into the affordable housing system. Next piece is community preservation and improvement. There are about 45,000 manufactured housing communities across the country, It's really hard to figure that out because most states don't regulate them, so that number is hard to get precise, but that's a good guess. 98% of them are investor-owned, meaning that they are for-profit ownership, which is in of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But in many markets, in many states, these are largely unregulated. For example, there's no requirement for a lease term. You know, you own the home, but you lease the space underneath you. But in many states, there's no lease requirement, no one-year lease requirement, for example. There's no automatic renewal or you're outside of a cause for an eviction, for example. And of course, there's no rent control, and I'm not advocating for rent control, but if you own the home and you have to move it because you can no longer afford the lot rent, you are in a deeply difficult position. So we believe that nonprofits and cooperatives, the residents themselves, through something like the resident-owned cooperative, the Rock USA model, should be given the opportunity to purchase the communities when they either go up for sale or they're being sold for a new use, redevelopment. Thousands and thousands of communities have been lost over the past couple decades for redevelopment and for reuse, and mostly these are in high-end markets. For example, recent review of lost communities in the state of Minnesota found that over half, all but one, of the dozens of communities that had been lost, accounting for over 1,000 units, were in the top 50% of school districts in that state. And Minnesota actually has a pretty good has a pretty good school system, as you all know, and that's typical. These things are redeveloped for other use in hot markets, and that's the risk. So we do believe that families have the right should have the right to purchase them. 19 states actually have some sort of mechanism to allow that to happen, but of course that means 31 states do not. Mortgage financing, duty to serve, I mentioned that, and we are desperately hopeful that duty to serve will be meaningful for families in manufactured housing, particularly in the personal property space. 70% of new homes are financed through personal property loans, which means it's like a car, but it's about as joyful as buying a used car. And we believe that that market needs to change. 5 lenders today dominate 50% of the chattel financing market. Now that's not that different from the site-built market to some degree, except for the fact that two of those lenders are owned by one company, Berkshire Hathaway, and they control over 30% of the market. So that is different than the site-built market. And since they are not in the secondary market, they don't sell to Fannie and Freddie, there's really little data, little regulation, and little standardization that is, and it's hard to get into that space. So that's a big challenge. So we do believe that some innovative programs coming out of duty to serve and some state HFAs working with duty to serve can advance the program. We also want to note real quick, the 502 program, the USDA's Rural Development 502 program, recently launched, a year ago, launched a pilot in New Hampshire and Vermont to allow home-only in communities to finance new homes. And we're pretty excited about that. They just approved yesterday to expand that pilot to California, which we think is huge because that is by far the biggest market in the country. Just as an aside, there are over 500,000 manufactured homes in the state of California, half of which were built before 1980. It's ripe to be replaced, and as you all know, I think by 2020, all new homes have to be net zero in California, and manufactured housing, believe it or not, can actually make that happen. So we think that that's a very positive thing, so we're excited about that. Finally, the public policy piece. We just believe that there has to be a more supportive environment, particularly for the families in the communities. I talked about their leasing rights, but they also, many states don't have prohibition on retaliation. So for example, if you complain about the water and sewer in your community, most states don't prohibit landlords or the community owners from going after you to evict you or to harass you. Many states do not require the owner to allow resident organizations, which we think is fundamental freedom, as we call them. Many states don't require landlords to, many states do not prohibit landlords from denying the sale of a home to another party without good cause. So for example, many community owners vet potential buyers of the homes in their community, obviously, which is fair enough, but in many states they have a right to reject a potential owner for no cause. And what happens then is that the community owner can reject any real offer and then eventually push down the price, buy the home themselves, and then resell it at a higher price. This is what does happen in the market, and it's quite remarkable and predatory. So families will just walk away with less than the home was even valued at. So we think the right to organize and other fundamental freedoms are pretty important, and we work on the state to move forward with that. So here's something on the next slide, just one at a time, is kind of, oh no, it's the wrong, I jumped ahead. Oh no, I got rid of it, that's right, I'm sorry. These are, again, just 2 more images of homes. That's right. Here we go. So I want to talk about this. Sorry about that. My apologies. So this is something I like to share because even the game of life doesn't think that these things appreciate. So, you know, if you played the game of life at home with your kids, you know, I'm not quite sure how long the appreciation period is for the ranch style home, but if you play the game with your kids, it certainly seems like a lifetime, right? So the ranch style does appreciate. That's your starter home. That's like the first home my parents bought decades ago, and then they moved on. But the mobile home, you buy it for $80 and you sell it for $80. So even Hasbro doesn't give this housing stock a whole lot of credit. But that just speaks to the stigma and to the challenges that we have. That's why so many first-time homebuyer programs, so many zoning and planning officials don't support the use of manufactured housing in their communities. That's why it is such a challenge to mainstream this product, because of things like this. This is kind of just a funny way of looking at it, but I think it does speak to the reality. So here you are, just some numbers. I don't want to read what's on the screen and you have the things in front of you, but I think it's important to understand where this stuff is. It is dramatically less expensive to build. I mean, it is between 20 and 35% less expensive than site-built stuff. That's important. Only 9% of the housing stock of mobile home or manufactured homes are considered inadequate. That's much better stock than people would probably give it credit to. But perhaps just as important, it's 12%. It's home to 12% of low-income households across the country, and in many markets, it's much, much higher than that. It's really an important piece of the housing ecosystem, and I think it has to be treated that way, especially as we reconsider how we do make home ownership affordable to Americans post-crisis. We do have to look at other and alternative models of home ownership, and this is one, you know, with things like shared equity and loan and land trusts, which we think there's a lot of overlap with manufactured housing. You want to lower the cost of entry, lower the barrier, the cost of the entry barrier to home ownership for low and moderate income families. Manufactured housing is one way of doing it. There's also challenges, and we can't dismiss those. To the homeowner, as I said, there are limited loan options. By and large, if you buy a manufactured home, it is like buying a car, but with some major differences. Last time I bought a car, which was a Honda, I did get my financing through Honda Finance, or whatever they're called. But of course, I had other options. But I also I could have walked away at any point. The thing about manufactured housing is that often many people need to get into that housing right away. They don't have other options that they can consider, and they are willing to take the financing that is offered by the retailer. While it is rare for the retailers to get paid by the lender or to make a loan, that is in fact not permissible, there is reason to believe that because this is such an integrated industry that manufactured housing loans are not, homeowners are not getting the option that they should be getting in our view. In part that's because the market isn't as robust as it could be, but it's also because I think the way the network, the wholesale experience is. For example, again, I mentioned that Berkshire Hathaway owns the 2 biggest lenders in the space. They also own the largest manufacturer and the largest retailer. When you have such an integrated industry, it's not surprising that there are challenges to the homeowner. But there are also real positives too, I mean, that we could talk about, and we talk about a lot of those things, but the positives are there too, which I spoke about, and we can start talking about that in the next slide. As I said, it's a lower cost home ownership option. There's reduced energy cost. One study showed recently that if you replace a pre-1976 mobile home with an Energy Star or better manufactured home, about the same size, you can save $1,800 in utility costs in the first year. That is significant, and that could actually overcome the cost of taking on new debt through a mortgage to finance the home. One of the biggest challenges with any replacement program, frankly, is that the homeowners own their homes free and clear, and even though the utility costs are extraordinary, the idea of taking on new debt is a big hurdle to get over, and we get that, but that's something we have to address. Land security does enhance appreciation. So if you control the land through a fee simple relationship, obviously that's just like a stick-built home. But cooperatives are also shown with some limited research to afford appreciation, faster sales, higher prices, lower lot rents, and lower mortgage costs. So we do believe that there's some value in land security, obviously, and that's not hard to, I think, get your arms around. And also to the community. By the community, I mean to the locality. If you want to do new housing development, you can get more units per dollar. That's a big deal. You can make it blend in with the housing stock, as I showed you in some of the photographs. And finally, it's an economic development opportunity. In many rural communities, the manufacture of manufactured homes is one of the better job opportunities in the community, and this can be appealing to certain state community development authorities to show that this is an economic development opportunity as well. And these are just some pictures. That is a picture on your upper left, sorry, about from Rock USA, a community that they preserved in Massachusetts. It looks a lot like a typical suburban subdivision. Picture on the lower right is Turnpike Park Cooperative in Massachusetts, south of Boston. After they purchased their community, closed on the preservation, and now they own it, and they can be there for as long as they wish. So there are some very meaningful opportunities across the country. The scale is just too small right now, and we need to get it bigger. For example, Rock USA, who did that cooperative, is operating in 15 states. They've done about 12,000 homes. That's a drop in the bucket, meaningful, but we still need to. There's still a lot of scale opportunities to move forward on. And it's not just cooperatives. We're also deeply appreciative of the opportunities by housing authorities, nonprofits that have done some preservation as well, and those opportunities need to be expanded too.
Where south of Boston is that?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. I can't. The town escapes me, but
I used to live there.
Plymouth County, somewhere, I believe. Yeah. There's actually quite a bit of it down there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Again, this was actually a unit in the community in Appalachia on the upper left, which was replaced by that home. That's not the exact same home, but that was the model that the family replaced the one in the upper left. It's hard to argue that that is not a meaningful investment for the family, and that it would have been financed through a fee simple mortgage. The Kentucky Housing Corporation, for example, the HFA in the state is active in that space. So there are financing opportunities in the fee simple market, but again, it's hard to argue that something like that is not a meaningful investment. Finally, I just want to show you the scope of Rock USA. I mentioned where they are. They started in New Hampshire. That's why all the yellow dots, and you've never seen New Hampshire that big, but there it is, and that's where they started in the 1980s, and they've done preservation in those blue states across the country. You can tell what that looks like, and I'll make a comment on that in a second. They are trying to expand in some new states. We're looking forward to that. Colorado is next on the list, and that's a very exciting policy environment, actually. It's a state we want to be working in, and we've been trying for the last 2.5, 3 years to get some policy wins, which we have. But if you look at that, you can see what kind of states are in their market, and it's, you know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. We would love to be in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas, those kinds of places. Public policy just isn't there to support this kind of work. We do believe by getting a lot of traction in places like Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, that we could start showing, you know, have the learning and offer that as an opportunity for these other states. But at the end of the day, it is public policy. In Louisiana, for example, depending on the type of sale, if a community is about to be sold, they only have to give 5 days notice to the community members to leave. That is completely unreasonable to expect the families to get together to purchase it, or for a nonprofit or a housing authority to make a bona fide offer. Compare that to Connecticut, where you have 2 years after if the community is going to be closed. Now, Connecticut, frankly, just does not have the same number of units as Louisiana, so it's not quite as meaningful, but that does show you how important good public policy is.
And I know there's been some preservation work in some of those states that aren't blue. It has been Rock USA.
They're not Rock USA, and that's to be fair. California does have a fair number of cooperatives. Some nonprofit owners, absolutely, they have some very strong nonprofit partners, and we expect to see some more of that. In fact, California has one of the few statewide manufactured housing park preservation programs in the country, which is it's underutilized, but actually they've made some adjustments to its rules that we expect it to be more used in the next year. We know that the new director of housing in California is on board with this. We've had conversations with them, and we're hopeful. And you couple that with the USDA single-family finance opportunity, we do think there's an opportunity there. And then some other states have that. Florida also has quite a few cooperatives. So does Arizona. Those are typically, those are not limited equity cooperatives. So whereas Rock USA, for example, the price to get in is between $50 and $500. That's what a share is. In California, along the coast, or on the Atlantic coast of Florida, you could talk tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, to get in. So we don't necessarily see that as of interest to us. I mean, it's an important part of the housing stock, but that's not where our focus is. But that's absolutely a valid point. And Next Step, I talked about them. Next Step is big on the replacement strategy in new development. They are in 49 members across 27 states and DC. They do modular and manufactured housing, two very different things, but they are active in a broad range of markets, including in the South, and they are doing some very innovative things, particularly on the single-family finance side and with energy efficiency. The challenge is getting those two together. As everybody knows on this call, the difficulty of valuing energy efficiency is a challenge for all of us. But I think we're making some progress. Next Step is making some progress in this space, and that's going to be important for all of us. And that is the least important slide, but there it is.
Well, but that is key for folks who have questions that they don't want to ask right now. But I know Rebecca's going to open up the Q&A.
Yes, please send your questions through the chat box. And while you're thinking about them, I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about what you're hoping to see in duty to serve in terms of manufactured housing.
Absolutely, and we do see them as all together. So here's a couple things. So the rule, Fannie and Freddie are already doing manufactured home loans on the fee simple space, but it's about 1% of their portfolio. So that's very much on the margins. We would like to see them get into the chattel space. First of all, we would also like to see them do more fee simple stuff, and we think they can. There's some, Freddie just rolled out a product with Next Step in Kentucky, which was just announced, so just out the gate, so that's pretty exciting. Hopefully a lesson for other states eventually. That's very important. But we'd like to see a chattel pilot come out, but the FHFA authorizes a chattel pilot. We are hopeful that will happen. Now that has to be a very conservative product. We need data, but we do think it could work with Rock USA, with CDFIs, the state housing finance agencies. We are in constant conversations with all those folks to get them on board, but we are hopeful that will happen. The other thing is we hope that FHFA allows for research to be part of duty to serve, in the sense we do need data. We do need research on valuation of energy efficiency. We need performance data. We need lots of things to make this work, so we're hopeful of that. And then also, we also ask that grants be allowed. I'm not so hopeful about that, but we do think grants to CDFIs could support this product. One of the biggest challenges in manufactured housing, both on the fee simple and the chattel side, is mortgage insurance, which doesn't really exist. It's actually just coming back in certain markets, but for years it has not been there. And grants to support down payment assistance and other programs could get us a lot closer. So there's that. Plus, we also are, we are supportive of some of the land trust ideas on the preservation side, and obviously this is deeply integrated into the rural piece of the duty to serve as well. So all those things are very important to us.
Can I ask you about Energy Star and how that has been working in the manufacturing?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Can I go back to duty to serve? And one more thing that I wanted to emphasize. One of the questions, as you all know, they asked was about should multifamily investment in the preservation of manufactured housing communities be eligible for duty to serve credit. We absolutely believe it should be, and the 25 signatories on our letter agreed with us. Just to be clear, industry believes that should not be the case, and we believe that's very problematic. We are hopeful that they land in the right way. And I will be blunt, the industry believes they don't want the competition in the marketplace. Right. And that's why this would, if Fannie and Freddie were in the multifamily side on duty to serve, that would help facilitate cooperatives, nonprofit investment, and housing authorities to get deep into the preservation space, and that would actually cause competition for the market, and that's what they're opposed to. I mean, just
for clarity for folks, when you say on the multifamily side, you mean lending to the owner of a manufactured home park or property who then rents the units to residents, as opposed to...
No, rents the lots.
Sorry, rents the lots rather than units. But this is as opposed to lending in the single-family space, either through full fee simple ownership or through chattel loans on just the home, not the pad.
Exactly. That's exactly right, and that's really important. And Fannie and Freddie do multifamily loans in communities now. It's just they're just not as deeply affordable as we would like to see. Wells Fargo, Capital One, some other banks do a lot of work in this space too, and we're appreciative of that. But we do think they could get deeper in the affordability and on smaller scale, and which would help as well. And also, frankly, this would help rural markets. But on to Energy Star. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm curious what your sense of how well Energy Star ratings are working in this space. I know they work differently with different products, with both housing and non-housing products.
And work in what sense do you mean work by?
I mean, is it how big a differentiator is it to have an Energy Star rating? How meaningful is it in terms of the savings in utility bills the owner would see? Is it causing a shift in the market? I mean, I know for instance, the home appliance market, you pretty quickly saw a shift to where almost everything had an Energy Star rating. I don't know, are we getting there with manufactured housing? Okay.
And I should know the number, but it's about 5% of the market is Energy Star, if that.
It's so small.
It's tiny, and it's really inexcusable. Now, part of the challenge has been who controls the rules. Right now, the Department of Energy controls the rules for energy efficiency in manufactured housing, just like they do in the rest of the Energy Star world, and that makes sense. Some people advocate that it should all go back to HUD. I'm not convinced of that. I'm not going to say one way or the other out right now, but that's constantly a talking point. DOE did just, close their comment period on energy standards, so we're hopeful something good will come out of that. I do think they are meaningful. They add a meaningful difference. Next step in their work, which is only energy efficient homes, actually better than Energy Star, they have documented the value that it adds to the homeowner, and I think if we can get loans to reflect that, because one of the biggest challenges, frankly, is that the cost of Energy Star, which could be $6,000, $8,000 on, say, a $60,000 home, if that is not captured in the appraisal, you're not going to get the loan, and that's the challenge. And there's a disconnect. So.
And we see that same challenge in affordable housing that is trying to be greener. Generally, there is often, not always, but often a higher upfront cost, and if it's not captured in the value in the financing, it's hard to make it happen.
Right, and that's exactly right, and that's the big challenge that we're seeing right now. We're hopefully, as they get a bigger share of the market, we're hopeful. And as I noted, on the 502 pilot that's in Vermont, New Hampshire, now California, hopefully Oregon shortly, that's only Energy Star or better homes, so that will require a better appraisal and evaluation project, or to come from that, particularly in California where it is so important. So we are hopeful that that will move the market as well. And Fannie and Freddie hopefully can learn from that, which they will. I mean, we do desperately believe that standardization across different platforms is vital to this.
Well, and I know we've been, in the Green Affordable Housing Coalition, we've been tracking the SAVE Act for a while now, which would focus on valuation and making sure valuations include the energy effects of the home. Do you know if it covers manufactured?
I don't. That's a good question.
It'd be worth checking on that.
Well, I think they've gotten it.
There's been various iterations of it.
At the last meeting when Bob Sahadi with IMP talked about it, it was only FHA loans, which still could go on manufactured.
Oh, they do, absolutely.
But they weren't able to get the larger market.
All right, I got another one for you. I know there's some slice of the manufactured housing market that is second homes, vacation homes.
Oh, absolutely.
And those tend to be higher end, generally. Do you have a sense of how big a slice of the market that is? I know it's probably clustered in California and Florida, but
in Arizona.
Yeah.
We did have that number. I mean, it's a couple. It's not a huge percentage. It's like 10 or 12%. I think nationwide, 10% nationwide, something like that. I'm not absolutely certain because the census is imperfect to track that, to say the least. But yeah, I think that's probably about right. And I think if you go in those 3 states, that's about it. What's interesting, we did just release a study. It's a completely different issue, but it's a similar idea on manufactured housing in Appalachia in 5 states, in certain parts of the 5 states, but including all of West Virginia, to look at the quality of the homes, the cost burden of these homes and that kind of stuff. But we also found the dozens and thousands, tens of thousands of homes that are abandoned in Appalachia. So, and that's still captured by the census, and it's an interesting, it's kind of the flip side of what you're talking about, but it's all part of the image issue too. But yeah.
Well, and I was glad that you were able to point out how embedded in all of our communities manufactured housing is. I mean, that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring this to the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force, because a lot of the folks in this group are looking at tougher neighborhoods, trying to generate economic activity, generate new development, new interest.
Yeah.
And you know, if you drive through any suburb,
yeah, absolutely,
you will pass a fenced-off area with no sign, and you go, oh, there's the affordable housing, because it's the trailer park that no one wants to pay attention to. Everyone wants to pretend isn't there. You know, in some cases, it's got signage. They look like stick-built homes. You know, it feels like it's integrated in the community. But a bunch of other places, it's not. It's very much walled off.
Absolutely.
And it's when folks are thinking about how do they re-envision a neighborhood, how do they bring not just housing but transportation and new business and you know, better health, better food options, all that stuff. They need to be tackling the manufactured housing portion of it.
I think that's exactly right. So, and I think that's exactly how we think of it. And I think people would be surprised about how common this is as a part of the housing stock in their communities. You know, there's one in Staten Island. People don't get that. I mean, if you drive through it, you're driving right past it. And that's there's a very, very big park in Chicago, huge. It's on Lake Michigan. Again, a valuable piece of real estate, but it's there. There's a number of them in Portland, Oregon, an extraordinarily expensive market. Thankfully, we have there's great nonprofit partners and a very strong HFA in Oregon, as we all know. But that's a preservation struggle too, because there's almost no crazier market in some ways in Portland for lots of different reasons, between the cost, land use, lots of different things. The sheer number of breweries taking up the land, you know, all these challenges that the housing stuff.
The beer housing tension is a major problem.
It is that balance. You have to get that balance right. But anyway, so all those kinds of things are important. But then, you know, my favorite example, and this is not a struggling city, but there are 54 mobile home parks in San Jose. That's not a struggling community, but each of those are at risk for redevelopment. Although again, California has pretty good law, and the city of San Jose, to its credit, has tried to preserve them. But you know, the cost is prohibitive. I mean, you know, how much are you talking about per space, per unit to preserve if a community owner wants to sell? But 54 parks in San Jose, that's unlike nothing else in the city.
Yeah.
And you know, similarly, the city of Palo Alto just recently preserved a park through the Housing Authority. There's some other options. We're hopeful some of the ballot initiatives that are going on in the state, but also in the Bay Area in particular, can be targeted towards this kinds of preservation. The city of Oakland has long done work with manufactured housing as infill. Other cities in California as well, as has Seattle. One of my favorite examples is in Washington State, the Housing Authority in King County, but also Snohomish County, which is the suburbs of Seattle. Both have preserved 4 parks each, some of which are for seniors, some of which are for families, and they do a spectacular job. And I would encourage people to take a look at Snohomish County's website in particular. I mean, you can't tell the difference from stick-built. But they also developed a relationship with credit unions to get the financing, and they've done a great job. But these are models that can be done, and this is workforce housing. That's how we have to think about this. This is why it has to be preserved, because it's, you know, again, everybody knows this. It's cheaper to preserve than to build. But these are there, and these are also families who are, you know, doing the work that needs to be done. And to put them further in the exurbs or beyond is not in anyone's interest.
I'm curious if you've seen creative models for preservation that deal with the density challenge, that this is, manufactured housing is low cost to build.
Yep.
It's relatively low density. It's higher than some stick-built, you know,
for an urban
single lot, but it's, you know, it's one level, and there's generally some space between the units, so it's lower density. When you have that in an area that changes from rural to suburban, where you see a lot more demand. I'm thinking of an example in Colorado where some of the resident organizers contacted us for help. I know you've talked with them too, where there's a lot of pressure. Yeah, and you know, some places there's higher and better real estate uses for the land.
Absolutely, I get that.
But it seems like logically there should be a preservation strategy that maybe it doesn't preserve those physical homes, but it preserves a place in that community as it is redeveloped, as it gets more density and gets more added to it, so that folks can remain. Have you seen that as opposed to let's preserve the park?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about that because obviously every case has to be addressed individually,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really hard. I mean, there's a couple different pieces here. Some cities and some states have relocation programs that if the community is going to be rebuilt or redeveloped for a different use, that the family has to be compensated.
Mm-hmm.
It's rarely enough for them to get into another home ownership opportunity. Though.
Right.
That's part of the challenge. So really, if you're going to ask a developer or a jurisdiction to do that, to make the family whole is really expensive. And are you willing to do that?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one
Yep.
issue right there. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars worth of equity perhaps that might be lost. The second piece is it's still cheaper to preserve those communities, but I do get the density part of it. But far too often, and as you said, you talk to some of these organizers, and it is a mixed bag across the country, they're often not part of the political fabric. They're often not part of the discussion, and there's no obligation for anybody to talk to them. By the time they get word that this community is being reused or resold or sold, the conversation, that horse is out of the barn.
Right, the loan process,
right,
the deal is being written.
And they don't have a legal obligation in 31 states to have any role in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, a lot of this is, again, it's disproportionately Latino, and that's a challenge for, for organizers, but also for city leaders, but it's also ripe for exploitation.
Right.
And we've seen that repeatedly. Again, you're talking to the families in Colorado, that's exactly what we're seeing. We see this again and again, and that's a challenge too. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we need better public policy to allow them to be part of that conversation. If they want to remain in their community, we should do the best job that we can to keep them, whatever the housing stock ends up being. And there are definitely density issues, but I think one thing that we have to be aware of is that not every city is, of course, as dense as D.C. or New York, obviously, or California.
Nor will they be.
Or should they be?
Yeah.
And places like Portland still have a pretty, pretty strong single-family communities, and this could be a part of that. But I think you're absolutely right. But I think the conversation has to include these families, and that's often not the case, which is, the same story that we've heard on public housing, redevelopment, and all sorts of other issues. This is nothing new.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. When I was with Howard County, they did a redevelopment of a park and did use CDBG money to relocate families and assist them, but it ran into the same challenges with a housing authority redevelopment in that you had layers of tenancy. So the owner was renting it to someone who might have also sublet space or rent to somebody else. So following that so that everyone was made whole was a challenge, but also the undocumented situation. And you couldn't give them anything legally, federal dollars. I mean, it just got really complicated, and I'm sure and it's a shame that we're not able to kind of share best practices across the industry in terms of, or the affordable housing space in terms of how do we solve that in public housing, because it would work in manufactured housing.
It would, absolutely, and I agree with you. And but part of the challenges are that we just don't have the same rules. I mean, the Uniform Relocation Act doesn't apply to manufactured housing unless certain federal funds are being used, and they're not going to be used unless you're actually going to preserve the community or do something in the interest of the family. So there's easy ways around that, and that's unfortunate too. So unless the state has good law to protect those families, a really good example of really bad public policy is just down the street in Manassas. You might have heard this in the Washington Post. There's the East End Mobile Home Park. It's about 30 or 40 units, heavily Latino, a number of undocumented families. The community has been there for decades. But they've had significant infrastructure, water and sewer issues, which is extraordinarily common because running down the water and sewer system is one way owners are able to sell their property for a different use, because they can say, I can no longer afford to repair this, the city doesn't want to repair it, or the county doesn't want to repair it, they want to connect it to the municipal sewer, whatever it is, so somebody will come in and redevelop it for townhomes and get all the breaks and the blessings that they need. So the city of Manassas has offered to pay $1.8 million to buy the park from the owner, without yet figuring out what to do with these families. But for years, they were citing the community owner, but without forcing him to make any repairs on the water and sewer. When years ago, in my view, from what I've read, and having spoken to one of the Washington Post reporters on this, it would have been a lot cheaper 5-6 years ago to repair the water and sewer issues than it is today. But that's all part of the pattern that we see, frankly, among industry. And again, because Virginia does not have very good law in this space. And you know, Loudoun County doesn't have very good law on this space. And Loudoun County, as many of us know, is the most expensive, or is the wealthiest county in the country. So preserving workforce housing, you would think, would be in their interest. I can only imagine what's going to happen to these families. I mean, it's just you know, beyond belief that they'll spend $1.8 million basically to reward a bad owner. Right? We wouldn't allow this in multifamily housing. We do in some jurisdictions, but that's, you know, that's no longer really what we do. It's pretty remarkable.
And in the jurisdictions where you do have bad actors who are tolerated in the multifamily space for kind of milking the property, right, letting it run down but extracting revenue from it, they're usually excluded from getting public resources, right, as a buyout or as a benefit. And I think that is a place where the manufactured housing sector needs to catch up. I
think that's right. And you know, this individual, whoever he is, you know, should be shamed. Should be on. You know, HUD has a ban list. It should be on. The state of Virginia should have one too. I mean, you know, if you know, if he ever invests in some other property or whatever it is, he should not be permitted to do so. If there's public money in there, but you know, I have no comment.
And there's also value in having positive incentives for the owners who are good stewards of the real estate,
which many of them are.
Yeah. So finding ways to reward for-profit and non-profit owners who run their property sustainably and rent in a non-exploitative way and provide services to residents. I mean, there's ways to do it well.
And I think that's a great point. We talked about, you know, housing authority, nonprofits, and cooperatives owning. They only own 2% of these projects out there, these properties out there. To make duty to serve work, to make these communities truly preserved and affordable and part of the ecosystem, we have to include for-profit owners. And there are a number of good-sized ones that do a very good job. A couple operating solely on the East Coast, including in Maryland, that do a really nice job. They have long-term leases, 30-year leases for their families. They have amenities. They don't shut those things down. They have no health and safety violations. They allow you to post, believe it or not, post a for sale sign on your property, which many community owners don't let you do. They let you use a real estate agent. Many community owners won't let you do that. So, I mean, they do the right thing, and they should be rewarded and integrated into part of the housing finance system. We totally agree with that. We do think it's easier to start with the nonprofits for various reasons, but those are the kinds of groups we want to. But this is such a diffuse industry. Yeah. Most owners only own 2 or 3 or 4 properties. And it's hard to get your arms around. But we do think if we can work with some of those better players, and they're out there, some of this, but also some of the larger ones are horrible. I'll let you know that too. But some of these guys, you know, no need to name them, but they are doing the right thing. And maybe they could show their industry brethren that they can operate profitably and do well by their residents.
All right. Well, I think with that, we will conclude this month's meeting. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks so much to Doug. And we will send out notes and the recording in a couple of days.